want to borrow, yeah, I want to borrow from you. It's just simply a database. And
yes, but
the risk is on the borrower and the lender.
What's worrying me that you understand this is that it's possibly your background in education and finance. You want to preserve it somehow as if it's providing a service. But what service can be provided? You're assuming that if I say
what I'm getting at is, are you saying that will fail? And if that will fail,
no,
will
it would cause failure if it's allowed to introduce further money subject to interest. Especially if it develops any inertia and traction.
Yeah,
in fact, that would consume
money.
It would consume the rest of the circulation, eventually dedicating all of it to servicing the ever-escalating sum of debt that it would inevitably generate.
No, sorry. It doesn't get involved in money creation at all. It's simply there's an existing sum of money.
Its only options would be to tie in to the common monetary foundry, as any e-commerce now ties into a bank. The difference is that the currency isn't subject to interest. There is no exploitation. In effect, mathematically perfected economy is the monetary equivalent of barter. If I could buy a $100,000 house from you with a $100,000 house that I have, if you wanted to trade houses, but being as that's not always the case, you want $100,000 of currency, which would suffice for you to buy whatever you want. You see, this is where monetization vastly outstrips the potentials of barter, because it becomes a universal medium of exchange, but it's only a universal medium of exchange if the currency is immutable, and it can only have a mutable value under mathematically perfected economy, which eradicates exploitation, multiplication of artificial indebtedness, and imposes this obligatory schedule of payment, which alone maintains the perpetual one-to-one relationship. So there's no potential for this business to enter into this business by Facebook, eBay, anybody else. Well, there's one process of monetization.
If all money went, obviously the fractional reserve banking is abolished in this economy. There is no fractional reserve banking.
Nor if there was a fractional reserve banking, could it reasonably compete among an intelligent people. There's no reason to buy your $100,000 house at 5% interest to pay 4 or 5 houses over some period of time when you can just pay one house for it over even a longer period of time. There's just no reason for it. It can't even compete. So there's no reason for it to exist. Same thing, I'm sorry to say this to you, I know it's going to burst your bubble.
The reason it would exist is because it's, obviously you've come up with ways of dealing with this, but you just can't, people screw up all the time and they don't repay. And the risk needs to be the person that's lending and the person that's borrowing, and it's a contract.
But there isn't a person that's lending in a promissory obligation. There is the creditor who gives up property for the promissory obligation, and then there's an obligation to maintain the integrity of the promissory obligation. So there's only the matter of enforcing payment and retirement of principal upon the debtor, or more properly, the obligor. But the risk of that is it's reduced to negligible. Under mathematically perfected economy, you still have criminals. You still have ways that this may happen.
What I'm trying to get at is because what you're saying is that there's one and one only.
Solution.
Yeah, there's one and one only solution. So I'm trying to think what's wrong with this model that I'm proposing.
If you're proposing that there's no way to account for non-payment, then that would apply to a multiple degree to the present system. So there's no solution for that. But I'm not saying there is a solution for that. I'm saying you have to enforce non-payment upon the person who fails payment. And any there's such reasonable ways of doing that, in reasonable and diverse ways of doing that.
Sure, yeah.
But it's preposterous to assume that that's even an issue. There is no risk to anybody but the creditor in non-payment.
I'm not calling that an issue. What I'm trying to get at is I'm trying to get at what you're saying. Why this solution? Well, not that it's my proposal, but I still can't quite see what's wrong with an economy where there's no fractional reserve banking, there's a money supply, and that money supply is lent between people for interest.
Well, what you're doing is separating. You said in your interview with Bill Stills that the problem is that these things exist under one roof. Well, separating them doesn't nullify their consequences. If we take right now, and in truth, the Treasury prints the money, the Federal Reserve buys it from the Treasury for the cost of printing, and then that's in the case of physical money. And in the case of non-physical money, the Federal Reserve just creates it on its books and then does things like purchase federal bonds, for instance. Now, which, of course, creates a debt subject to interest because interest is paid on the bonds. So the money is created as a debt subject to interest. Although there's some obfuscation of that, what it resolves to is the fact is the money is created subject to interest. So we actually have right now the very separation you're talking about. We have one entity, the Treasury, creating the money. We have the Federal Reserve loaning it into circulation, subject to interest. We even have a further stage where all the peripheral banks, which are the banks that can fail, which interface with the public, quote-unquote, borrowing the money from the Federal Reserve banks, paying interest on that, and then loaning it to us at a higher rate of interest, and the margin of difference being their profit. You see?
Yeah, but there's a difference. The difference is they're creating it as debt through the bond market.
But overall, the money, is created as a debt subject to interest, and in the end, the fact that the market, the people, the subject industry and commerce, are subject to servicing debts subject to interest, in the case of every cent that's introduced into circulation, is what produces the effect. So by separating it, you don't nullify its consequences.
What you do, but the problem there is the interest on the money created, not the interest on existing money.
Well, the one results from the other. Whenever you create money as a debt subject to interest, that is what comprises this implicit obligation to maintain that circulation so that you can continue servicing the original obligation, which is to pay debt plus, or principal in other words, plus interest out of circulation. You can't fulfill the obligation if you just pay it out of circulation and don't borrow it back.
Is this accurate to say that when somebody when somebody lends money for interest, then the inevitable consequence is that money needs to be created plus interest as a cause and effect? Is that correct?
Yes, if and only if the resultant industry and commerce become dependent upon that circulation. Then and then only. If that was just $10 even, if that $10 becomes vital to the circulation that was loaned into circulation and might, over a long-term debt, for instance, require paying out of circulation $10 in principal and $40 in interest, or $50 altogether. At the end of that time, when that $50 obligation was paid, there would be $50 of debt, because in order to maintain that $10 in circulation, the $40 of interest that we paid out of circulation would have to have been borrowed back into circulation as new debt just to maintain the $10. You see? So in the end, there's $50 of debt relative to the $10 of circulation. And that's the process you have to understand in order to realize that if that money is introduced into circulation as a debt, or if existent money is loaned as a debt subject to interest, it only multiplies debt in proportion to the circulation if the commerce and industry are dependent on whatever was loaned, the principal. That's what multiplies it. If there's no such dependency, for instance, if there's trillions of dollars in circulation right now, and I loan you $10 and say, I don't like you. I know you need this $10, and you're such a jerk that you couldn't get this $10 from anybody else, and I know that after I loan you this $10, a week from now, you're going to be able to pay me $100,000, and you need it that bad, so I'm going to charge you $999,990 in interest on it. Okay, does that engender terminal failure? Absolutely not. Not unless the industry and commerce were perpetually dependent on that $10. Now, in the case where money is created and introduced to circulation as a debt subject to interest, the industry and commerce are absolutely dependent on it. And can we get $1 into circulation? Can you and I get $1 into circulation without borrowing it into circulation? Does the banking system or the government ever give it to us? Absolutely not. Nor would that be right, because every unit has to have this incumbent, obligation to pay it out of circulation, or we can't solve inflation and deflation. So in the case of the central banks banking systems which have been imposed upon the world, that dependence upon the circulation goes without saying. So I don't make the matter more complicated for people to understand, but the fact of the matter is, if you loan $10 and all money was spent into circulation, doesn't exist excuse me again, it doesn't exist as a debt. Excuse me. What that means is, we're not going to suffer terminal failure because you loaned $10 at interest. We would suffer terminal failure if and only if if existent industry and commerce somehow would be so dependent on that $10 that as it borrowed it and paid back 15 or whatever the interest and principal, it would have to borrow the interest in order to maintain the circulation to itself.
So there is, if you figure it out, there is a cutoff point at which that system won't work, and there is a cutoff point in which that system will work.
Well, excuse me. I probably just wrecked the very thing that you just said. I'm getting a little bad here. The thing is, the cutoff point. See, no system is right unless its principles are justified. So in the first case, what you're proposing has no justification. There's no reason to do it. In the second place, it can't compete with mathematically perfected economy because
to get something implemented, you're gonna have to give the policymakers something that is not so radical that they're going to resist it forever until the system collapses.
Well, I disagree vehemently about that, particularly as I have interacted with so many politicians for so long. Number one, if you're counting on the politicians, it doesn't matter where they are in the world. Libya, Egypt, all the Muslim countries in the world, Christian, Judaic, Hindu, whatever.